Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 3, Halacha 1. Now, one of the forbidden labors is going to be with fertilizing your field on Sheviis. Now, non-Jews and Kuthians, they're allowed to fertilize their field on Sheviis, but a Jew is not. Now, you're allowed to bring fertilizer to your field and store it there. You can make a big dung hill and you can hold it there. In my childhood, we had a backyard in New York where we used to pile up all of the leaves and wood chips and branches, and we would store it there over the winter, and the mulch would improve over time. And the quality of the mulch would break down and would get better and better. And in fact, we would keep piling onto this hill of leaves year after year, and it would only improve and improve. So you're allowed to do storage. Now, something you could say is, well, what about the piece of area underneath this fertilizer? Aren't you fertilizing that? And you're not really using that piece of land per se for growing a crop. It's really just, again, as part of the storage. And there has to be certain conditions on if you're going to store the fertilizer there. Fertilizer is very important in growing crops. It's a fundamental part for trying to get any kind of yield out of a crop. Some of the fertilizer that was used in the old days would be dung from chickens. They would also use from cows and donkeys. They would gather it up. And you could also use, again, for hay. A lot of the hay that had already been wet and maybe was used to help to keep the plants warm. You can use it as fertilizer as well. It'll break down and it'll get to be pretty good. So the Mishnah starts off and it says, from when may one remove fertilizer from one's courtyard? Now the Rambam in this, he explains that fertilizer is being used and removed from the streets where straw and other organic matter would be dumped so that people and animals would trample on it and make it usable as fertilizer. So in the old days in cities where people had donkeys, and they would use donkeys for carrying things in cities and in streets, and they would use horses. The horses would go to the bathroom all over the place, and so would the donkeys. And in places like London, they used to take the chamber pots and throw it outside, and so you had a lot of garbage and stuff into the streets. And it's basically saying that you could take from the courtyard area or a street area, and you could remove it and you could haul it away as fertilizer. So it says, from when may one remove fertilizer from one's courtyard to be piled up in storage heaps in the field? Now, the common practice was you would make this ashpa, which is a dunghill, and you basically would gather up all of this into a field, and then what would happen is you would take your pitchfork and you would scatter it later across the field to fertilize it. Now, these dung hills that are used as storage purposes only, the rabbis are going to be forbidding forming them. And why would that be? Because of Marasain. Marasain comes up a lot, chapter 3, Halacha 1, because people would think that people are actually fertilizing the field. You can't do that in Sheviis. So, certainly you can form this dung hill before Sheviis, but during Sheviis you can't form them. And the question is going to be, what the Mishnah is asking, at what point may one remove fertilizer to these heaps without being suspected of fertilizing the field in Sheviis? So that's really going to be the question the Mishnah is asking. And the Mishnah is going to answer. It's going to say, from when the Jewish laborers who work the fields in violation of Sheviis have ceased fertilizing. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. So about this, the Rambam says that it seems strange that the Mishnah would give legitimacy to the activity of Jewish farmers who are violating Sheviis by using them as the gauge for determining the end of the fertilization. So there are others who are explaining that this is actually laborers that are non-Jews. And these are the words of Rabbi Meir. So in this time, the Rambam, in trying to explain what this is from, when the Jewish laborers who work the fields in violation of Sheviis have ceased fertilizing, the Rambam is saying in Shemitah Ve'ovel 2:1 that before this time it is forbidden to bring fertilizer into the field, even for storage purposes, lest one be suspected of fertilizing the field, and that basically you're trying to prepare it to do planting, and you're trying to plant during Sheviis. That's a violation of the Torah. So only after the workers have finished their fertilization of the fields is it allowed to form these piles, because once the fertilization season is over, no one is going to suspect that the piles are being used and heaped there for immediate use. Rather, says the Rambam, they will assume that they are being accumulated for use over Sheviis until after Sheviis is over, and that's going to be a case where they're not going to be using it. Basically, the time that you normally would fertilize has passed. Now, there's going to be a dissenting. There's actually going to be two dissenting views. And Rabbi Yehuda says it is permissible to remove fertilizer to the heaps from when the sweet ground dries up. And that's going to be the opinion where you have the moist earth actually is dried up. And that's what it refers to as the sweet ground dries up. And it removes, and it creates, removes the moisture, and it creates all these cracks and crevices. And when you have this dry, cracked earth, fertilizer is going to be useless. It's not going to have any point. And when you see this dried, cracked earth, if you were to take from the streets where you're having donkeys and everything else go to the bathroom and remove that fertilizer to the fields, you're not going to be getting any sort of suspicion that you're going to be planting and trying to fertilize the field, because again, the ground is dried up. And there's going to be another opinion. The second opinion of this dissent from Rabbi Meir is as follows. Rabbi Yossi says it is permitted to remove fertilizer to the heaps from when it becomes knotty. Now, this is a little bit different than Rabbi Yehuda. This is basically saying that the ground begins to dry and it develops a knotty texture. And the idea is that Rabbi Yossi is referring to the time when fertilizer begins to dry up and thicken and become knotty. And once this occurs, the fertilizer is not loose enough to properly fertilize the ground, and there's no fear of arousing suspicion that you're trying to fertilize the field during Sheviis. So, in other words, that this fertilizer that has been accumulated sort of in the streets or in the courtyard from animals going to the bathroom, that has become so dry, and this has become so desiccated, basically, that you could, says Rabbi Yossi, gather it up and bring it out, and it's not really good for fertilizer. So you have the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda saying that, it's when the ground dries up, and Rabbi Yossi's opinion is when the fertilizer itself really ceases to be good as fertilizer. Now, the Mishnah is going to specify how much fertilizer and how many piles can be heaped into the field once the permissible time has arrived. Now, again, this is all going to be related to Morris Ein problems. So, The Mishnah says, how many dunghills may be heaped up in the field, and how much fertilizer may each heap contain? And the Mishnah says one may create up to 3 dunghills per betseya, with each dunghill consisting of 3 containers of fertilizer, and each container containing a lesech, and one may add to the number of containers being dumped onto the dunghill, but one may not add to the number of dunghills allowed per betseya. So we see here that we have the measurement again with the betseya, and the question is, how many piles would be spread out over that betseya field? And if you had too many piles, it would give the impression that you're not really piling it up, but you're actually in the process of fertilizing the field. And the idea is that one may not make a dunghill with less than 10 containers full, and you can add as many containers as you want. Even if you wanted to add 20 containers to a pile, there's no problem. But the idea is that if you had a small quantity of a dunghill for this storage pile, then people would walk by and say, this is not a dunghill at all. It's actually just been used to fertilize this area. So the idea is that you have a minimum size of each dunghill, and the pile can be as large as you want, because again it's clear it's being used as storage, is not being used to fertilize. Now, Rabbi Shimon says about this in the Mishnah, one may even add to the number of dunghills within the single betseya. In other words, the Rosh says that Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that as long as the fertilizer is piled up in dunghills, it will not look like somebody's actually fertilizing. So even if you have, say, more than 3 dunghills, but they're very large and they're clear for that it's for storage, that you can do that. But the idea is that it has to be obvious that it's going to be a dunghill and it's not going to look like any possibility of fertilization. So you have a minimum measure for a dunghill, basically. The Gemara is going to get into this first part of the Mishnah, where it says, from when may one remove fertilizer to the heaps? In other words, when are the laborers going to be able to move this fertilizer from these courtyards that again you can tie up donkeys and horses for transport, and they'll be going to the bathroom, and you want to clear out your courtyard, and you don't want dung all over the place, and you don't want to just throw it away because it's perfectly good as fertilizer. So when can you start doing that? The Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, before the laborers who work the fields are finished fertilizing. And it says, what is the law regarding whether it is permissible to make a dunghill at the entrance of one's courtyard? In other words, it's asking, is this activity prohibited until the fertilizing season is going to be over? So the idea is going to be, is this going to be the time, when it is still forbidden to remove fertilizer and bring it over to the fields? And the question that the Gemara is asking, says the Pnei Moshe, is this. It says, although it is forbidden to pile up dunghills in the field before the time is designated in the Mishnah, perhaps this is only because such activity arises moris ein, the suspicion of onlookers who will think that they are fertilizing the field, and that fertilization could happen in Sheviis. So if the dunghills are not being piled up in the field, but rather being made at the entrance of the courtyard to create room for the accumulation of more fertilizer in the courtyard, no one will suspect that the fertilizer is being used to fertilize the field during Sheviis, and they will realize that the activity is taking place as storage, and that's going to be the idea. So the Gemara is going to cite 2 versions of an incident where this answer comes to light. In other words, it's saying, rather than take all this waste matter that's accumulating up in the streets and in the courtyard. And again, you tie up your horse and then you're going to go ride to town or something like that. Your horse is going to the bathroom the whole way. And certainly when you're tying it up and feeding it while, it's next to your house, it's going to the bathroom. Well, you don't really want a dirty courtyard. It's not nice. It smells. So they're saying, look, rather than accumulating it and bring it out to the field, which is going to be a problem for Sheviis, why don't I just take it to the entrance of the courtyard, pile it up over there, and then it'll be clear that this is going to be just used for storage. And they're saying, what about this? Is this going to be allowed? Is this going to be able to be done, regardless of time, so you don't get this Morris Ein problem that you're really going to be, doing this wink, wink, nod, nod, nudge, nudge thing, where you're really going to be, taking this fertilizer out to really sprinkle over your fields to help improve your fields and help improve growing, and maybe even to be growing on Sheviis itself. Keep in mind that if you do take fertilizer and you sprinkle it out over a field, then you are going to be preparing the ground for the 8th year's production, because fertilizer will improve the quality of the ground for the next year. So you could, in theory, take this fertilizer out, sprinkle it out over a field in the 7th year, and in the 8th year you'll get a much better, much more high quality yield because you've fertilized the ground, you've improved it, and it nourishes the ground. Well, you're not allowed to till the ground, plow the ground, and do things that are going to improve the ground for the, in the 7th year, for when you're going to start to grow in the 8th year. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to prepare the ground like that. So that could be another concern about taking fertilizer out, and where you want to make sure that it's clear that this fertilizer is really as storage and not for trying to improve the ground. So the Gemara is going to give, an incident through which this answer comes to light about whether you can stockpile this manure and waste that could be in the streets or in the courtyard and bring it over into a central area at the front of your courtyard. And Silni posed this question for Rabbi Chia bar Ba. Rabbi Chia bar Ba forbade him to make dung hills even at the entrance of the courtyard. However, Rabbi Hanina stated that Rabbi Chia actually permitted him to make these dung hills. So, according to this version, Rabbi Chia held that even accumulating the fertilizer at the entrance of the courtyard would arouse suspicion, and because it would arouse suspicion, you're not allowed to do it. And in the second version here of Rabbi Hanina, they're mentioning that Rabbi Chia actually differentiated between making piles in the field, which is not allowed, and making piles at the entrance of the courtyard, which is allowed. So again, it reads, Rabbi Hanina stated Rabbi Chia actually permitted him to make use of these dung hills at the courtyard. And because of this lenient ruling, Rabbi Chia suffered slander, where people would look at him and accuse him of showing favoritism to Silni. And the Gemara says, and people were saying Rabbi Chia took Meiser from Silni in the past. And basically what they're implying is that Rabbi Chia is taking a bribe from Silni, which is why they gave him this ruling. And basically they're saying that Rabbi Chia wants to ingratiate himself with this kind of activity and help Silni increase his crop yield so that he'll get more Meiser in the future. So again, are you allowed really to pile up dung from a courtyard and store it in a courtyard? Yes, you are. You're not even bringing it to the field. You are. But if you have an uneducated population that can't differentiate between the courtyard and the field, and they're mixed up on the laws and they don't learn much, then it's going to look like you're allowing this behavior not because it's being a storage place that's not even in the field, but they're going to misinterpret it, misunderstand it because they're ignorant, and they're going to say, oh, this is really a bribe, and the rabbis are taking bribes, and really he just wants him to help him grow so he can collect more Meiser, and also he's being lenient with him because he gave a miser in the past, and all the stuff that they say. So what happened was, in order to get out of this Loshen Hara, Rabbi Hia took the following action. It says, Rabbi Hia ruled for himself that he was allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael and go to Chutz La'aretz in order not to be in the position that he would have to take Meiser from Silni any longer. In other words, that he left Eretz Yisrael in order not to take Meiser, and basically he ruled that he's allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael under these extenuating circumstances. And the idea is that, he's basically making sure that it's clear he's not taking Meiser from Silni. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky is suggesting that it would have been disgraceful to the holiness of Meiser to refuse to accept it when he's offered it. So you have a problem to just refuse Meiser, because it might be, like what Rabbi Kanievsky says, a disgrace to the holiness of the Meiser. So to get out of this tricky spot, he basically ruled that he's allowed to leave. Now, Rabbi Hia, where he's actually called, he's called the Babylonian. Rabbi Hia was originally from Bavel, and he moved to Eretz Yisrael in order to learn Torah from Rabbi Yochanan. Now, he was being accused of ruling leniently in Silni's favor in order to gain additional Meiser for himself in the future. And that's the sad story about this. So, in theory, you're still allowed to do the piling up in the courtyard, but this is an unfortunate thing. Now, the Mishnah stated that it's only permitted to heap fertilizer in the fields for storage once the fertilizing season is over, and that's going to be before this time. It's going to be forbidden because of Maris Ein. That's going to be the appearance of wrongdoing, where onlookers will suspect he is fertilizing the field for Sheviis. And the Gemara asks, and it says, now that we have established from the Mishnah that there's a Maris Ein involved, even after the laborers who work their field during Sheviis have ceased fertilizing the fields, it should still be forbidden to remove fertilizer from the courtyards to the fields because of the appearance of wrongdoing. And that is that it should be forbidden to remove fertilizer any time during Sheviis, so that people will not say that he is taking the fertilizer out into his irrigated field. And the question would be, those fields are going to be worked and fertilized all year long. And, the question is he going to be fertilizing these fields also during Sheviis? So it creates this Maris Ein problem. So the Gemara is going to explain why we're not concerned about this possibility in this case. And the Gemara is going to say that the people of his city know whether he owns an irrigated field or not. So it has to do with whether it's going to be a field that's going to be fertilized with rainwater or not. And these fields are going to have enough watering from the seasonal rains to have specific times on when they're fertilized. So in a local area, they're going to know that, no, this guy has a field that's just relies on rainwater, doesn't involve any kind of irrigation where you're putting pits into the ground and you're taking buckets out and removing the buckets and hoeing the water into the field. No, you're relying just on rainwater. And because it's a very specific type of field where it's relying on the seasonal rains, that you're not going to need fertilizer except for certain periods of time, and everybody's going to know it, and that's why it's not going to be a Maris Ein problem. So the Mishnah is going to be speaking of this kind of case where where the person if the person does not have an irrigated field, then there's not going to be a worry that they're going to suspect him of fertilizing this kind of field during Sheviis. And the Mishnah is speaking of this kind of case, but if a person has the irrigated field, then you're not allowed to remove fertilizer from the field, even from the after the fertilizing season's over, because people in the city will know that he owns an irrigated field, and then they're going to think that he's fertilizing it during Sheviis. So the Gemara is going to infer this rule about Maris Ein from the preceding Gemara, and it's going to say, Rabbi Yosei says this teaching, this teaches that the sages were not concerned about the suspicion of passers-by from different cities with regards to the appearance of wrongdoing. In other words, the Mara Fulda says that only the people of the city that he lives in are privy to know the true state of affairs, and only they are taken into account when determining the possibility of arousing suspicion about illegal activity. But outsiders, although they may suspect that one has an irrigated field and he's not fertilizing, are not taken into account. That's what this is saying. The Gemara discusses the permissibility of storing fertilizer in a field before Sheviis, and it says, during the 2 rabbinically prohibited periods of time that precede Sheviis, it is permissible to make storage piles for fertilizer that conform to this arrangement. In other words, the arrangement that the Mishnah is saying. So the idea is from Pesach to Rosh Hashanah in a grain field, and from Shavuot to Rosh Hashanah in a tree field, you have over there, rabbinically, that plowing is going to be prohibited. And so too, we're saying here that from this period of time, you're also not allowed to do fertilization of the field, because in a way, fertilization in the field is going to be like a subset of plowing, because you're making the ground ready for future crops. And so in this way, you fertilize it, you take it, and you spread the fertilizer all over the top of the ground, and all the nutrition breaks down and goes into the soil, and it gets that soil ready for future planting. So this is really going to be like a subset of plowing. And so you would say that you have these 2 rabbinical periods of time that precede Sheviis, and it's going to be one for the field of trees and one for the field of grain. And so from then until Rosh Hashanah, it's not going to be allowed. The Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say that we can learn the answer from the Brisa, which states, one may sell fertilizer to Jews who work their fields during Sheviis, and one may even work together with them to take out the fertilizer from the courtyards to their fields in the entire 6th year until Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year. So if you catch that, this is talking about Jews. This is not talking about non-Jews, okay? And the Gemara says that one may work together with a non-Jew or Kuthian to take out fertilizers from their courtyards to the fields, even in the Sheviis itself, provided that one does not actually unload the containers of fertilizer into the field. So let's break this down. So in the case where it's going to be where he's working together with the Jew during the pre-Sheviis period, as this Bryce is talking about, or whether it's going to be the non-Jew or Kuthian during Sheviis itself, or after this rabbinically ordained period of time before Sheviis, okay? So he's allowed to just transport the containers of fertilizer to the field, but he's not allowed to empty them into the ground. And he may not empty the containers even to make a storage pile, because it's going to look like he's working for a person who violates Sheviis. And that person, it looks like he might be doing work for somebody whose idea is actually going to be to fertilize this field. So by emptying the containers, he's actually going to be fertilizing that part of the field, which also, by the way, actually is going to be forbidden. That's the note by the Chazan Ish. So there's also going to be a question about whether he may spread out the fertilizer over the field, because that, in fact, is actual fertilization, which is forbidden. So the question is, if you have a Jew who's going to, work the field during Sheviis, and the question is, are you going to be able to do this during this permitted period of time, until Rosh Hashanah? And the answer is that basically where it's saying that if he's working together with the Jew during this pre-Sheviis period of time, then he's allowed to do it. But if he's doing it where it's going to be after this prohibited period of time, then it's going to look like he's helping a person who's going to be violating Sheviis, and then you're not allowed to do it. But you can also do work together with a non-Jew or Kuthian for a non-Jewish field, and you can even take out that fertilizer to the field even in Sheviis itself. Because again, a non-Jew who owns a non-Jewish field and is not going to, he's going to be working it himself. Are you allowed to take out, containers to the field? Yeah, you're not allowed to unload them, but you are allowed to take out the containers because he is allowed to fertilize a non-Jew allowed to fertilize a non-Jewish field. So the Gemara is going to continue with this proof, and the Brisa says that that only provided that he does not unload the containers into the field, but as for taking the fertilizer out to the field in the prohibited pre-Sheviis period of time, one may indeed take it out, even if they employ a Jew who is a Sheviis violator. And that's surprising. But, we can assume that the Jew will not fertilize his field immediately and that he will pile up the fertilizer in the field. And, then it brings up the question, well, how do you pile it up? So, if you're making dung hills prohibited where you're piling it up, then even taking out the dung for the violator would be prohibited, because assisting him would be in this process be transporting the dung, and that would be the problem of assisting a sinner. So how does it work? In other words, it's saying if you have a problem where you're not allowed to make any dung hills at all, well, then it's going to look like you're in the employ of a Sheviis violator. And basically, it's going to look like maybe he's not going to fertilize it now, but he's going to fertilize it later. And so it's going to look like there's a problem. So the Gemara says that the Brisa tells us during this pre-Sheviis period of time, it is permitted to make piles of fertilizer as per the specifications of set forth in the Mishnah. And they would say, if you would say that this is forbidden, then it should be forbidden to take even the fertilizer out to the field on behalf of the violator. So the Chazan Ish says about this that if making dung hills were to be prohibited, which they're not, then taking out dung would surely be deemed to be helping out a sinner, since it would obviously set the stage for some sort of sin, either by making dung hills or actually fertilizing. So the idea is that they're trying to prove out that you're allowed to make dung hills, and they're saying that if you weren't making dung hills, you weren't allowed to make dung hills, then you would end up where it would be like you're helping out a sinner. But again, you're allowed to make dung hills. So why is that? Because again, this is trying to demonstrate that this is an allowance because it's being used as storage, it's not being used as fertilization. So the Mishnah said that it is permissible to remove fertilizer from the heaps when the sweet ground dries up. The Gemara is going to explain what is sweet ground, and that says that the drying up of the ground refers to the cracks that appear in the land when the moisture evaporates. And Rabbi Manna said, the cracks referred to here are the cracks of the valley that become filled with water when it rains, and it's takes longer to dry out than the rest of the ground. And Rabbi Yehuda is holding that it is only when these dry cracks actually appear, and that only then may one start making storage piles for fertilizer in the fields. And the Mishnah said that Rabbi Yossi says it is permissible to remove fertilizer to heaps from the ground when it becomes knotty. And I just want to point out that, according to the Marafulda about this, that, even when the moist earth of the valleys dry up, fertilizing is not going to be effective in all the locations. And removal of fertilizer to the fields is not going to bring up suspicion that you're planning to fertilize a field. So the Gemara is going to explain about this, about the ground becoming knotty. And it's going to say this is defined from the time when the ground develops many knots and it becomes lumpy in texture. And once this occurred, fertilizer may be removed to storage piles in the field. And Rabbi Hanina elaborated on this and said, as soon as the top layer of the ground becomes knotty, it is permissible. It is immediately considered dry, that's knotty, and the removal of fertilizer to the fields becomes permissible according to Rabbi Yossi, so that it's not necessary for the ground to become dry even beneath the surface. Rather, we're talking about the upper layer of ground is going to show these knotty, dry textures. And so the idea is that at this point you can bring fertilizer to the fields, and it's going to be allowed according to Rabbi Yossi. So what's going on over here? So this is talking about where the field becomes so dry that it's clear that you can't use this for fertilizing the field. So they're saying, can you bring this from one storage area on the 7th year over to the field? The answer is yeah, but what's happening is that the ground is so clearly dried out, and perhaps even the fertilizer is so clearly dried out, that it's clear that you're bringing it out for storage for a future season. You're moving it as storage. You're not moving it as part of an agricultural activity for now. And so it has to be very, very dried out so that this person is not going to be suspected of moving it any earlier when it's still going to be good for fertilizing. That's the idea. In other words, if you let him bring it out earlier, then it's still going to be a good time to fertilizer. And he might say, well, maybe tomorrow he'll fertilize it. So basically, when the ground is already so dried out in the 7th year that you no longer would get any benefit from spreading fertilizer onto this ground, at that point you can move it for storage. That's the idea. So Rabbi Hanina is going to give support for this explanation of Rabbi Yossi's opinion. It says it was taught in a Baraisa concerning the segment of the Mishnah that the opinions of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi are close to being identical. So basically they're saying it's almost the same time, and they're basically saying that if Rabbi Yossi would require knots beneath the surface, then this ruling would represent a much later time for when Rabbi Yehuda allows it. And Rabbi Yossi is referring to the knots on the surface of the ground, which appear at the same time that this sweet ground would dry up. So they're effectively describing the same time. That's what this Gemara says. And the Mishnah stated that one may add to the number of containers being dumped into a dunghill. And then the question is, can you add the number of dunghills that are going to be allowed during a betseya? Rabbi Shimon is saying that you can have extra dunghills per betseya. So this Gemara is going to talk about the qualification of the Tanna Kamma's restriction against adding to the number of dunghills. Rabbi Yirmiyah says that the prohibition against making more than 3 dunghills applies only if this is accomplished by decreasing the number of containerfuls of dunghill, and so that one may not distribute 30 containers full of fertilizer among 4 dunghills, because it would create a dunghill that had less than 10 containers each. But it is permitted, according to the Tanakama, to make 4 dunghills where each one would have 10 containers full each. So if you had 40 containers full and you wanted to make 4 dunghills, each being 10 containers full, you'd be allowed to do it. But you could not take, say, 30 containers full and make 4, because then it starts to look like you're actually in the process of fertilizing a field. So the Gemara is going to object to this interpretation by the Tanakama, and it's going to say that since the Tanakama states that one may not make more than 3 dunghills, which you explain to apply only when each dunghill has less than 10 containers full of fertilizer, this implies that making 3 or less dunghills is permitted even though they comprise less than 10 containers full each. And Rabbi Yosef asked why, if one reduces the number of containers full in each dunghill from the 10 mentioned in the Mishnah, then even making 3 or less dunghills is forbidden, for the Tanakama states specifically that one may make dunghills of 10 containers full each, meaning that the piles of less than 10 containers full would be prohibited. So the Vilna Goan says that Rabbi Yosef disagrees with Rabbi Yerushalmi's premise that a prohibition exists only when 2 adverse factors are present. And in his opinion, the Rabbi Yosef's opinion, according to the Vilna Gaon's explanation of this, a pile of less than 10 containers full cannot be considered a storage pile, and making such a pile would be perceived as fertilization. So the Vilna Gaon says that Rabbi Yosef understands the Tanakama to mean that 10 is the minimum number of containers full per dunghill, even when the field contains 3 or less dunghills, and this would seem to contradict Rabbi Yerushalmi's ruling. So keep in mind that this question about how many dunghills can you have and how many containers will each dunghill have, this is presuming that you are already doing it at the ascribed time. Now, this Mishnah talks about when can you do it and how much is it. So you have to be talking about a time when, let's say, you're making a storage area and the ground becomes very dried out and it has cracks on the 7th year, and then you can make these piles. Also, by the way, if you were doing this right at the edge of, say, the time on this rabbinic prohibition on the 6th year, and you were making the dung piles too small, then you would also end up with a problem, because it would look like you're going to be preparing for fertilizing a field during the 7th year. So again, you have to match this quantity of how much, and you have to match that up with the other thing in the Mishnah, which is talking about when can you do this. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that rather, because it's going to try to give an alternate explanation of the opinion by the Tanakama. It's going to say what we are dealing with here in this Mishnah, the Tanakama states that one may not add to the number of dunghills per betseya to come up with, say, more than 3 dunghills, is a case where one makes each dunghill from the amount of containers full mentioned in the Mishnah. In other words, 10 containers full or more. And even regarding this case, the Tanakama would prohibit adding to the number of dunghills per betseya. And the Gemara is going to give a proof for this later explanation of the Brisa. It's going to say that this explanation of the Mishnah is in accordance with that which was taught in a Brisa, that one may not add to the number of containers used to make each dunghill. That, by the way, is 10. And even though the number of dunghills per betseya remains constant at 3, And it says that nor may one add to the number of dunghills in the betseah, even though the number of containers per dunghill remains constant. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. But the sages say that one may add to the number of containers used to make each dunghill, but one may not add to the number of dunghills in each betseah. So according to the Tanakama, who are disagreeing with Rabbi Meir, and by the way, it looks like disagreeing with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai as well, they're saying that you can have just three dung piles per betseah, but you can make the dung pile as large as you want with as many containers as you want. So as long as it's more than 10, you can keep piling them on. But what you can't do is come and make a fourth pile and make it so that each one has exactly 10. They're saying that you can't do that. So the Gemara is going to develop a proof, and it's going to say that when the sages disagree with Rabbi Meir, stating that one may add to the number of containers per dunghill, does this not refer to the case where there is a full number of dunghills per betseah? And surely it does. It means that there's already going to be 3 dunghills per betseah. And likewise, when the sages agree with Rabbi Meir and state one may not add to the number of dunghills in each betseah, they refer to even a case where there is a full number of containers full per dunghill. So they're saying that Rabbi Meir said that you can't add to the number of dunghills, that it has to be 3. And they're saying that in this case, the Tanakhama agree with Rabbi Meir that you're limited to 3, and that even if you were going to try to make a fourth one, and you were going to make sure that this 10 containers full is going to be for a fourth one, so that it should be legitimate, Rabbi Meir and the Tanakhama say you can't. So what we see here, according to the Tanakhama, is that you may not make more than 3 dunghills per betseah, even if each dunghill has the full allotment of 10 containers. And even if you wanted to put 10 or more containers of fertilizer into this fourth dunghill, you can't do it. And so you are capped at 3, and each one of these 3 dunghills have to have at least 10 containers full. Otherwise, they would say, go and make it just 2 piles, because it's going to look like you are fertilizing the field. And tomorrow in Halacha 2, chapter 3, Halacha 2, we're going to get into this dispute between the Tanakhama and Rabbi Shimon about making more than 3 dunghills. Have a great day.